to talk about caught in a landslide. You all know Ben. I'll just say a couple of things. He comes to us after a BA Hons at Leiden and an LLM from Edinburgh and a shift to that other better Edinburgh where he is very close to completing what I can say with no bias at all is an absolutely brilliant PhD. You can read his work in Policy Quarterly and in the latest, most recently released Environmental Defense Society report. Thank you. Hand it over to you, Ben.
Cool. Thank you, Lisa. Kia ora koutou. Ko Ben Ingoa. Welcome to my talk. This should be very fun. Sorry for the wait, everyone. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Zoom World, for your patience. Off we go. I had very little time to think of the title, and I just thought of a bit of a funny one, and I don't regret it. Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. Apt. So, who am I, first of all? Am I Dan? Pan? No, I'm Ben. I have been called all of these names. I much prefer Ben. If you insist on calling me one of those ones, Ban. That's a beautiful river in Northern Ireland. We can go with that. But I just think it's, funny to start with who you are and just let you know that you're in safe hands. These are all look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. I'll just lead you through it a wee sec. We've got Property Purgatory, my PhD thesis, and a couple publications that sort of spat out of the PhD thesis about climate change compensation and the idea of property purgatory. And then my most recent work with the EDS, shout out to the EDS in Zoom World. If you're watching, you'll be all eating your pasta lunch, I suspect. Greg and Fernanda said that they'd listen in, so hello to yous. That's what I've been doing the last year, is working on a project with them on Aotearoa, New Zealand's Climate Change Adaptation Act, building a durable future. We're looking to inform the Climate Adaptation Act, which is part of the wider resource management reform in Aotearoa. As of yesterday, so it's all wonderful timing. What we're going to realize throughout this talk is that this is moving apace, this topic, apace. Auckland has one flood and suddenly it's a national issue. Anyway, doesn't matter. This is our most recent publication, came out yesterday, current legislative and policy framework for managed relocation. We will be talking about managed relocation in this talk. It's new, it's hard, and my plan has been slightly scuppered because it took a wee while to get going, but my plan is to just rip through the talk and then get into a bigger discussion about managed relocation at the end. Everyone's nodding in this room and presumably in Zoom rooms as well. So that's good. But first, I thought that we'd start with a poem, or as my Scottish high school principal used to say every Wednesday, a poem. And it's a beautiful poem. I put it at the beginning of my PhD, and I just thought this would be a nice way to relax after the stressful setting up the Zoom, for one, and settle ourselves. It's 2 p.m, take a wee beat, listen to the words. It's really lovely. It's from a book called More Favorable Waters. Aotearoa Poets Respond to Dantes Purgatory. Not bad at all. And wherever you are, just enjoy it. It's called When We Had All Spoken by Anna Jackson. Oop. When we had all spoken. When we had all spoken, we put it to the vote. We each deposited our token. We voted to go on by rote. We voted to head towards the doom we were already heading towards, too late to make a difference, some said. Still room for more of the same for longer, some said. Some said it wasn't that they didn't see the future loom in the distance, but the future was so far ahead. To live in it now would be wrong. This, before we stopped talking, was what some of us said. And then we stepped, spread out 1,000 steps along the lonely road, each wrapped in silent thought, concerned with appetite, its right and wrong. Some thought of flights and some of freight, and some thought of all the images kept in a cloud that we had imagined being without weight. Though the truth is, we knew there were damages and costs we were not counting. The truth is, we had been strangers in our own lives, our mounting fears strange to us, our planting of trees. Here, the trees are few and the range narrow, but from time to time, we can hear a bird arrange itself on a high branch and sing. All those songs lost in a cloud. What is a song with no one to hear it? And now, this long silence. And now, this. And now, this. So that's the poem. The truth is, we knew there were damages and costs we were not counting. That's the point. There's multiple times throughout this presentation where I'm just going to say something and say, I didn't need to write a thesis. I could have just put that on a page. And I feel like that stanza in Anna Jackson's poem is one, right? The truth is, we knew there were damages and costs we were not counting. But you got to fill 300 pages somehow, as we all know. And some would prefer you did it in 250 pages. But once you get to 250, you got to do 300. So that's just the way that goes. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I've already done Who Am I? I've already done the poem. Part one is a wee bit on climate change and property purgatory, just a reflection on my PhD thesis. And then part two is not too much gloating, but a wee bit of scenes from Auckland, and then I was right. Part three is, okay, what's hard about the fact that I was right? Not good. It's a dream come true, but it's probably more of a nightmare. What's next? What are the big questions? And so I don't want to go too hard into the paper that we've written on managed relocation, because Raywin and I are going to do that next week. And hopefully the Zoom is much more working then. But I wanted to extract three big topics and ask some questions, put up some news headlines beside the questions, and just to get people's brains going a wee bit. And then we can talk about it all in the context of the recently come out work on managed relocation, and then have a yarn. So that's the plan. Okay. Climate change and property purgatory. This is the bit, you know, whenever you're at a climate change presentation and there's the IPCC report that comes up, and then someone's like, yeah, we're burning too many fossil fuels. It's all going up into the sky, the global warming. There's always a couple slides about that. I will spare you all. If you don't believe in global warming and you're here, I'm just kind of impressed. So well done, I guess. Well, I just thought this was a more interesting slide to put up, because it literally brings it home to us in New Zealand. It's probably a wee bit dated at this point, but you get the idea. It's a wonderful sort of graphic representation that this is a topic that literally invades people's lives, and it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And so this was the sort of risk profile that we were looking at in 2019 when I first arrived and first started the project. And this is the risk profile and the sort of data that we were working from. And it was this idea that sea level rise equals foreseeable damage to property. We can measure this, we can predict where the sea level rise is going to go. What does that mean for people? What does that mean for property prices? What does it mean for your insurance? And I drew this picture in 2018, and that was probably another instance where it was just one wee thing that could have been the whole thesis. You know, if I could have just put that as uploaded that to eVision, that'd have been sweet. And I've never found myself straying from this as an accurate depiction of what's going on. You've got wee Linda at the end. She's connected to her house quite intensely. In retrospect, she's kind of chained to it, but we'll ignore that. And there are two stressors. You've got one stressor of climate change, and you've got another that's connected to climate change, which is this climate disaster in a box. And I wanted to get this point across that climate change is a cause of these extreme weather and events, in that it catalyzes them and it makes them occur more frequently and more intensely. That's the point. So it's this double-pronged attack on your connection to home, your connection to place. And what the thesis was about, and something that we identified back in 2019, was the stress that this places first on your insurance, and your insurance premium can go up and up and up, and maybe even ditch you. And then you're stuck because you have no way to recover your funds to move away from the danger zone, which you need to do because that's why your insurance left in the first place. Or, yeah. Another stressor is that this recognition of risk caused by climate change can cause a loss to your property value. And then you've got less equity by which to get away. And so all this contributed to this stuckness, this purgatory that people were in. And the PhD went in to look at both how this purgatory is interpreted by local councils and what local councils could or should be doing ahead of this situation, responsibilities wise. And then it also looked at two other impacts that are caused by property purgatory. And it's those two impacts that I wanted to get into a wee bit during this talk. And one of them is this ongoing individualization of risk. Insurance companies and us are able to increasingly granularize the packets of risk. So whereas before you might take a packet of 10 houses and that was, you know, as small as you could go, and you'd measure that packet's risk, now you might be able to take 3 or even 1. And that is a good thing in the sense that you can accurately assess and represent that smaller packet's risk. Packet 1 may go up 30% in terms of an insurance premium. Packet 2 may pay less. That's great for packet 2, you know, could be seen as a collective benefit, and, you know, maybe it is. But at the same time, we're isolating these packets, and it means you can square off these much more risky parts, whereas before they might have been able to just sort of be absorbed by the larger collective risk sharing. And my fear was that this isolation, increasing isolation, was going to cause more discrete instances of property purgatory, more discrete instances of people being unable to recover funds to get away. Now, the second interesting takeaway was this increasing expectation and acceptance by everyone that you can shoulder any risk ahead of these circumstances of foreseeable risk, so long as you contract away your ability to maybe sue the council. You can live in that floodplain. And again, this is a very difficult conversation that we haven't figured out yet. And on the one hand, absolutely, autonomy. It's good. I am pro people exercising their rights to do mostly whatever they wish within the boundaries of the law. That's good. But at the same time, there's a public safety issue. If someone's waived their recourse to, public responsibility in a sense, then do we rescue them when the flood comes in hard? Have they waived the recourse to be rescued? I think we should probably still rescue them. I'll put that out there. Rescue service is good. But then what decision are we making about what position we're putting those rescue services in? So that, neither of these are super cut and clear, but there are interesting takeaways from the thesis that I think can get lost in what happens at the beginning of the thesis, which is looking very much at local authority responsibilities. And that's been part of my role at the EDS, is looking a lot at planning provisions, resource management, the like. So I'll just get my fears again. My fear for the increased individualization of risk was that it would lead to more instances of property purgatory, the lack of capacity, the lack of ability to recover funds, to move away from the danger. And then my fear with this increasing expectation and acceptance that people can just shoulder risk no matter what the magnitude of that risk is that it leads to an othering, and that after these events, we would be callous and we would say, they brought it upon themselves. Idiots. What do they expect? Move into a flood zone, gonna get flooded. And it's at that point I tie it back into Dantes Purgatory, where they're looking and othering the sinners in hell. At this point, it's quite beautiful, because they're literally on the hill, you'll see, and the sinners who they've othered are sinking in the frozen lake. I thought that was a quite on the nose metaphor for where we could be going in our version of hell. Take heed how thou steppest. Go so that thou trample not with the soul the heads of thy wretched, weary brothers. So that's kind of the tone I'm setting. Where are we now? This is where I get to gloat a wee bit. Climate change is already putting the heat on insurance companies. Auckland's floods could be a turning point. And I was going to set out this slide so I'd have my wee drawing in the corner, and then I'd highlight the parts of the drawing as we sort of move through what's happening in Auckland in the last few months, but I didn't have time. So you can just imagine where we are in the drawing. It's going to be quite obvious. Literally putting the heat on insurance is the same. It's happening now. That's the point. Sea level rise equals foreseeable damage to property. It's foreseeable, sure, but it's also just at the moment, it's sea level rise causes damage to property. It's happening. This storm, or the Auckland anniversary floods, happened the week of my PhD examination. It was bittersweet. We're going to see more and more of this, and I think we're not ready in terms of anticipatory measures moving forward, but also measures in response. We won't go too hard into that. And so there's the damage that occurs as the event happens, and then there's the implications. So this is where we're getting into the insurance aspect. We're moving down the chain. What does it mean that these events are here now? Oh my goodness, these properties are becoming uninsurable. Now the compensation discussion. I like this one because it says they won't be compensated, and then that there's a 1 billion flood recovery program. And I suppose I put this slide up mainly because I want to highlight the immense impact that the Auckland anniversary floods and the cyclone had on New Zealand's psyche about damage, about foreseeable damage, about managed relocation, about climate adaptation, about emergency response, and about compensation. The entire discussion has changed now. It's not even a will there be compensation to me. It seems like it's a how much are we going to do? And then it's a okay, local government, how much you got in your pockets, how much you want from our pockets, and then how much of that are we gonna do? So I think that's a moment. This is a moment that we're in now that we'll look back on as a real watershed. Is that a really bad pun? A watershed moment for the climate change compensation discussion. Even if at the moment it's wrapped in disaster recovery, I think that's key. That this should also be seen as an adaptation discussion. Again, compensation. You know, in 2018, Ben Franz Hudson and I wrote a paper called Climate Change Compensation and Unavoidable Discussion. This is again me. I was right. And people just thought, well, why would we pay people if they're living in these zones? Then, you know, what do they deserve? Did they not know? But we're still, and it's a good thing, we're still seeking to help people when disaster strikes. And then there's a whole nother presentation to do about people's mentality towards compensation before the event and after the event. But we don't have time for that. So that was the Auckland anniversary floods. For those that think it's a one-off, this was 2 days ago. These are happening more frequently and more intensely. Okay. Enough time. Oh, we're singing. Managed relocation. Managed retreat. Get it out of your mind. It's managed relocation. I've had words. Here's our wee paper. You'll all have to read it. It's very good. Great pictures. You know, EDS, great pictures in the outputs. Well done. There's some really great, what would be the word? Sort of gaps in the current legislation, and then a rickety staircase. It's good. So I don't want to take away the thunder from the webinar that we're going to do next week too much, but what I am going to do is talk about 3 of my favorite topics in this paper. Identifying risk as part of managed relocation. Community dialogue, which is a big one, but it's important. I thought that this term encompassed the most. And acquisition, very spicy topic. Okay. Identifying risk. And so what I'm going to do here is just lay out a few of the major questions that are raised in the paper and by me generally. And then I'm going to link them to just a couple examples, and I'm going to do that for each: identifying risk, community dialogue, and acquisition. And by then, you'll just be inundated by all sorts of questions about adaptation, and then we'll take a wee beat and then discuss them. Is that good? Cool. First question in identifying risk, and it's deceptively easy, hard. I never understood how to use that phrase. It's trickier than it looks. What are we measuring here? Are we measuring risk to life? Are we measuring the integrity of a building? Are they the same thing? Are we measuring timescales? And what's our threshold going to be? One of the big conversations at the moment is, do we need a definition, a blanket definition on intolerable risk? Because then in legislation, you can just chuck in, oh yeah, past the point of intolerable risk, X happens. But how do you do that? You know, it's easy enough to say the words, but once you start thinking about it, it becomes just extremely difficult, which is probably the same for all of these questions that we're going to see. How do we keep tabs on what is getting measured and what isn't getting measured? And if it's not being measured, how do you know it's not being measured in the first place? Here's a more legalistic one. Are there any obligations in legislation for what should be measured? And how strong are those provisions? There are existing national instruments. There's a national adaptation plan that's going to come under review quite soon. We're all going to learn from the Climate Change Commission how well the government is adhering to the national adaptation plan. How much does that drip down to local authorities' responsibilities, obligations, duties? How much should it drip down? Is there anything that should drip up? Excuse the physics. This is that question. Is there anything that would be helpful for national legislation to require authorities to measure in terms of providing them with a platform to administer anticipatory adaptation policy? That needed a sentence break or a comma. I appreciate now. Law can help us at the national level. Legislation provisions can require us to do stuff, but can we shout upwards and say what we need and get help? This is maybe along the lines of what isn't getting measured, but is there anything that is unmeasurable, but we still think is important? The answer is probably yes. And then how do we do that? This is how current this is in terms of identifying risk. Tomorrow, we're all going to learn about these risk categories that these cyclone houses have been given. There are 4 categories, and they range from low risk, which means you can rebuild, to, I guess, super high risk and no rebuilding allowed. Beyond that, we don't know anything. I don't know anything. We'll find out about it tomorrow. But it's an example of this process of, okay, where are we at in terms of our risk, and how are we communicating this risk? And what does it mean? Here's one for, is there anything that is unmeasurable, but we want to mark as important? Yes, they're all over the country, and a lot of them are threatened by sea level rise. And how do we measure that risk, and who do we let measure that risk is another one. And then what? Because we need to have some sort of community dialogue about this. Consultation. I like community dialogue, but I'm done changing terms. Managed relocation, I think, was the hill. Why are we doing this? I think that's one that gets lost sometimes in the sort of broader focus on public safety. Is why are we communicating this risk? We're communicating it because of people's connection to land. Do we owe anything to these people to be consulted? Are we doing it to cover ourselves? What are the statutory obligations? That's a more legalistic one. Liability-wise, of course, what happens if you don't communicate the risk or consult? Who takes the fall if something goes wrong? Where is the liability going to be generally? This is something that I think local authorities are concerned with, because there's a distribution to be made between regional councils, territorial authorities, unitary authorities in terms of hazard representation and liability, and it is confusing. Is there a duty of care to be found in representation of climate hazard risk? You'll all have to read my PhD and find out on that one. It's near the beginning though, so you're all right. I wanted to put this in as well as part of the community dialogue and communication. Everyone in this room is probably pretty up on their climate change stuff. And just as part of, hey, Kaupapa, Hononga in general, in Zoomland, we as subject matter experts have a capacity to influence the discussion on and the community dialogue in terms of what gets valued in terms of risk as well, which I think is important to recognize. So I wanted to put that in. This is part of why we're doing this. Are we doing this so that people can make better decisions for themselves? Sort of a, here you go, do as you will. Or are we doing this so that we can justify ourselves for stronger planning decisions? And it's probably a bit of both, but it's two sort of interesting ways to look at the point of the dialogue. And then there's a question of demographic, I think. How accessible are these communications? Do we do it in the same way to everyone? Or are there specific communities, demographics, where we need to tailor our communication style? Here's a liability example. We don't need to go into the nature of this case, but it shows that local authorities are stuck. They're caught in a landslide when it comes to representing hazards. And in this case, it was to do with a coastal erosion line included on a cadastral map. And it had an effect on Mr. Weir's property value on the Kapiti Coast. And it was decided that the line didn't need to be there on the basis of the science, and therefore the line was removed. But what it shows is local authorities are trying these anticipatory measures to communicate and to carry out their responsibilities, perhaps duties. But there's also a counterforce of potential liability, which would be, let's be clear, it'd be devastating for local authorities to be found financially liable for some of these things. Janet Stevenson's term is eye-watering, stuck in my head. There are eye-watering ramifications financially for local authorities to be saddled with the liability for these things. So it's an extremely tricky tightrope to walk. But at the same time, as Justice Williams says, it would be, and this last line here, it would be a callous council indeed that was unmindful of that potential impact. What about planning provisions? And are we communicating risk just so that we can say, oh, I told you so, as we undertake to do very strong planning provisions in district plans? This is the plan for the West Coast. Really interesting plan if you're into plans, which I am now. Thank you, EDS. And I think it's interesting because not that long ago, you'd have been horrified to see the words manage retreat in a district plan. This is one wee bit of it, and it's everywhere. This is much more ubiquitous language now. The term and the idea of managed relocation is crystallizing as a very, very real option, and maybe even sort of the preferred option, I think, for a lot of local authorities and communities across the country. I put this in about consultation because I just want to rep the South Dunedin Futures project. I think they're doing a great job. I just love the art. That's part of it. That's wonderful. Yeah. That's it from SDF. I love it. Okay. Coming into the last few minutes here. Hope you saved room for the spiciest topic of all, acquisition. So we talked about, you got to identify the risk. There's lots of questions about that. You've got to talk about what you're going to do. And then if you decide that you're going to do a managed relocation, you've got to do it. You've got to acquire land, probably. I can't imagine that there's going to be a situation of managed relocation that doesn't engage with the issue of acquisition. So acquisition is the idea that the government buys land either by agreement. I go to you and say, how much? You give me a price. And then I say, cool, and then buy it, then amalgamate it into a bigger land, and then you can turn it into a reserve, a park, etc. Or you can acquire land by compulsion. I give you a price, you take it, and that's it. My question is it even possible to get this completely right? I don't know. And so as we're talking more and more and more about managed retreat, we need to also talk more and more and more about acquisition and this trade-off between acquisition by agreement and acquisition by compulsion. Jonathan Boston says it's urgent. And whenever I crop this photo, I left in the wee ad that was given to me about arts at Otago. You know, just thought I'd rep because I'm on Zoom. Top 1% in the war. And so managed relocation is not only increasingly discussed at a local authorities sort of community adaptation level, but by the communities themselves. How do we work? If there are communities that want to move, do we owe it to them to move? And then how do you set up in legislation to buy those properties? And the question is, I think, in terms of acquisition by agreement only, is if you pursue a policy of acquisition by agreement only and people decide not to agree, do you leave them there? Do they stay? Because then you're in your whole rigmarole of, oh, well, you decided to stay, and then finger wagging, you decided to stay, therefore, on your head be it. You've made your bed, now have a bath. So there's maybe a public safety issue there. And an alternative is acquisition by compulsion. Maybe that's the more public safety centric option. You say, listen, you have to move. Risk to life, too great. We're moving you. But acquisition by compulsion in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as in many countries all over the world, has a gnarly history. It's been used as a tool for dispossession for a very long time against a very specific community in this country, specifically the Public Works Act, which is the only tool at the moment, really, for acquisition by compulsion. So how do we navigate that? How do we navigate the fact that acquisition is government statement on your relationship with land, saying, I can move you off? And how that conversation has gone in the past on this land, and the public safety aspect of it all. It's hard. And it's getting harder. Sometimes I feel like we're barreling towards this and we're just starting to get the conversation going, but we're barreling towards it. So here's my PhD and current work and current mindset. Thanks for listening. I think I've kept good time. So good. Thank you. Oh, sure. Yeah, there's no, like, you don't do a response or anything? No, that's just.
I do not have an official response.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
This audience is going to have a lot to say. If
Cool.
you want me to
I like
take
it.
questions, I will. If you want to take them.
I'll take the
You
questions.
tell me.
No, it's all good. Okay.
Yeah.
Jen.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks, Ben. That was really interesting, but it was just 100 questions.
Yes.
So Can you tell me, is there a country overseas that is getting it right and figured out how to do it?
Yeah, so in our current, we just released working paper 2 yesterday, and I'm straight on to working paper 3 yesterday. So part of that is looking at case studies abroad and in New Zealand from different natural hazards, so earthquakes, primarily earthquakes, and where managed retreat or managed relocation has been sort of voluntary, and people have decided to, all right, got to up sticks and go. Australia has been toying with various relocations, but from what we've found so far, there's been no major government sort of legislation rooted scheme to undertake managed relocation. We would be the first.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, we can do it. We can nail it the first time. Yeah, but it might be one of those things where everyone's sort of looking around at each other and seeing what the other people do, and no one wants to be the first one in, because the questions about acquisition are so difficult that everyone wants to learn from case studies of everyone else. You know, it's hard. Go for it.
You talk acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
The next word I would ask about is displacement. Humankind have commandeered almost every usable space on the planet.
Sure.
And so you're going to be knocking into something, somebody else doing something else, feeding somebody else, etc., with your acquisition. Do you consider that?
So the question.
Other questions, but that'll do for one.
So the question is about just the you know, if people are moving from one space to another, that space wasn't sort of empty in the first place. Yes, the answer is yes. This is part of what makes it so hard, and it's another edge of the acquisition component, right? Are we going to acquire land to move people to? Do we have to do that? I don't know. We're not there yet. We're only going so fast. Yeah, it's just hard. The ideal way maybe is to, you know, you buy someone out and then they can just go and find somewhere. But at the same time, are you promoting community cohesion by moving a community as one? This is why the conversation needs to be really long and really well funded. Zoomland, if anyone's got loads of money, because these are the exact sort of second order consequences that get lost in thinking about managed relocation as simply acquisition by agreement, or simply a compensation scheme, or simply an amendment to the EQC, or simply changing a district plan, you know, as simply anything. It ripples outwards.
There's a phrase I'd like to see disappeared, and it's called land supply.
Land supply? Oh, that won't be in any of my writing.
Just as a follow-up, do we know how many people are going to be at risk of displacement in New Zealand? Because I'm thinking you're already in a housing crisis. You're about to lose company more.
Thanks, David. Thanks, David. You know, we know each other, so you could have sent me this question beforehand. Yeah, tens of thousands. You can look at what I can do is point you towards the recent NIWA data that came out maybe last week. Really good flood maps, and you can play around with all the little toggles. Look at your area and flood maps, and they even.
So have you not done like a systematic assessment of New Zealand?
We have. I just don't have a number for you right now.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. See. But it does bring up a good point about the fact that New Zealand is having a housing crisis, and that there are so many policy and legislative objectives, to use the fancy terms, for increasing housing supply. Well, at the same,
It's a housing crisis.
sorry,
Who says it's a housing crisis? Is it not an overpopulation crisis of one species?
I'm going to go with the housing crisis. And we've got, you know, a very understandable push to increase housing supply in New Zealand, and laws and policies to help us do that. And at the same time, now we're amping up climate adaptation measures to start preventing development in risky zones. And it's coming to a head. And how are we going to hierarchize? I don't know if that's a word. These two policy goals. Because if you don't build in the flood zone, you don't need to manage relocate from the flood zone if you've not built there in the first place. So I think there's a policy battle in there that's happening, and we're trying to bring it up sensitively in our outputs with the EDS. Should I go to Zoom and ask people? I see a hand in my periphery.
Thank you very much for your comment. Very interesting. One question, so I'll just say it to one. I guess, on this lovely one of acquisition, and assuming that the parties involved in the acquisition are, say, on the one hand, you've got a lot of community, and on the other hand, you've got members of the local government. And then it's like, oh, yes, let's come together and discuss what the acquisition might be. There's power relationships, there's power politics involved in that. So I think what will be important, it seems to be, is figuring out what a fair process is in that. I mean, especially also the overlay a treaty kind of set of roles and responsibilities in that, and spelling out what that could look like. It seems to me as being an important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try and paraphrase your question for the Zoomers. Zoomers. And the question is about how to reconcile in a fair way treaty with what we're talking about here.
That's one part, but I think firstly, you've got the power relationship that's always going to be involved. You might have the government that come along with their suits and say, oh, well, we have that, but the bill probably is worth $10. The local people might say, oh, no, it's worth $1 million. But they haven't got the power the sources on their side to actually negotiate well with the suits on the other side. It's not a fair process. So what would a fair process look like? And I wonder if you'd give a thought.
You always ask such easy questions, Martin. So it's about a fair process for addressing the deep inequities that will only be made worse by the negotiations about people's relationship with land in this country. That was for the Zoomers and for my head to buy myself time. I think that the first step of identifying the risk is where you can set the terms for so much of what is going to happen. And that bullet point on what is unmeasurable, but we still want to mark as important. It's not unmeasurable because it's not important. It's unmeasurable because it's extremely important. And if you can hammer that home super hard, that's a start. Then if you can gum up the works of acquisition hard enough, I hope Raymond's not listening to that one. If you can gum up the works of acquisition hard enough by really putting your foot down about how important treaty settlement deeds are, not just as legal documents, but as restorative components of this country and as just being a commitment to a better version of the future, whatever it is. That's to me sort of a foothold in that process. That the treaty settlement documents are and the treaty settlement deeds you're the person that got me onto them. I appreciate it. And, you know, there's over 100 of them. And that's something that I think needs a hell of a lot of work. And every single instance of acquisition across the country will and should interact with those treaty settlement deeds, because it has to, because the whole point of the deed was in response to the acquisition in the first place, right? So to me, a start to the fair process is bringing them up to the level and saying these are important. They're important back then, and they're absolutely going to be important as we enter a new sort of era of acquisition in New Zealand. And then it's just about doing it, and I suppose that's the super hard point. I don't know, have I stumbled through that answer well enough?
Yeah.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah, that would be good. Cool. Question at the back.
Yeah, hi.
Oh, yeah.
I'm one of two regional councillors that often the.
Oh, flip.
This is really timely.
Yes.
Work that you're doing.
Cool.
I mean, like South Korean, you mentioned that needing futures.
Mhm.
I mean, the population in South Korean is something like 10,000 people,
Mhm.
which is all total settlement. So, you know, the types of issues that you're talking about are being thought about right now.
Yeah.
in South Korean. And there's other communities in the target, you know, Relocate,
Mhm.
you know, should they be developing on an area that's fundamentally
Yeah.
got risks all around it and under it? You know, what's the development and so forth, but not just those obvious areas. You got places like Queenstown
Mhm.
in terms of what's the development plan for Queenstown? What's the set of criteria to enable and encourage development in the future? These are all really interesting things. So, you know, well done.
Cool.
If I have a question on the conclusion of this, do PhDs have conclusions?
My conclusion was a warning, and it was about, if we continue to individualize risk in the way that we are, people will go into property purgatory. And what we'll have done is, by consequence, because we'll have been doing the individualizing, we will have told ourselves and tell them that it was their fault from the onset, when it didn't need to be, when we could have done something different. And I'm not saying that we make a no-fault compensation scheme for people. That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying that we don't need to jump to the end and blame people when doing so does absolutely nothing and just makes them feel bad about a circumstance that maybe was a wee bit in their control, but maybe not.
There was a settlement from Bad Plenty, forgotten the name of it, so the process apparently was in quite well.
This is Matata.
Could be, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think one of these fundamental tenets was to enable people to exit with dignity.
Yeah.
And that sort of raises, that's taking me, because I mean, that's a challenge in itself, whether it's self-responsibility to start there. But nevertheless, if one could achieve that, I think that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's the goal, right? And it's just hard. But that was the second conclusion, and the conclusion was the first thing to do is just to go out and talk to people. You know, in Dantes Purgatory, the whole narrative structure is that he's in purgatory talking to people. They weren't real people. Well, they were based on real people, but it's, you know, it's a fictional book, I hope. And yeah, that's the, you know, that's the beginning, and the end is talking to people and acknowledging. I think there needs to be an acknowledgement by local authorities that local authorities will make mistakes, because this is new. This is a new circumstance. Damages haven't been foreseeable in this character sort of ever. The closest comparison is perhaps earthquake risk, but even that has a degree of randomness that means, okay, well, you can stay, but just be careful. There's no that with the sea level rise flooding risk, it's going to happen. We can measure these timescales to an increasing level of precision, and so that, you know, as you know, brings in an element of public safety that then brings in harder and harder obligations on local authorities. So it's a tightrope, as you know. So yeah, we can chat. It'll be fun. Yeah. Jen.
And there's a big organisation in the States, a big charity, which is gathering funds and getting requests from people to buy up property that is that should be management food and gifting it back to local councils and local bodies. Is there scope for something like an ACC scheme where people pay into it, collect en masse, and it is used to move people?
Probably. Yes. I mean, we're writing the paper now, so all contributions welcome. You know,
Not insurance.
Well, sure.
but it wouldn't move people. You know, or targeted rates. That would be another way to do it. Or do nothing. That's another, you know, we could do that. We could do nothing. Do I think that would be a good idea? No. You know, or spend loads of money and put everyone's houses on stilts. Why do we have to move? Why can't we go upwards? Very good, I think. Okay, one more. Yeah, go for it.
There's another regional councillor. If I'm
Oh, got it.
considering whether I should just go and shut myself in a darkened room.
No. No, I hope that wasn't the vibe.
Your comments about individualisation of risk are really interesting. I wonder if you've got any comment about that as part of a sort of wider thing we see in terms of individualisation of responsibility for poor health, seeing that as individual rather than food that's available or housing. Any comment on that wider sort of issue?
If we had longer, I'd go into a big spiel about neoliberalization. But we won't. Sophie's not here. That's why we won't. I think something that came up a lot throughout the research of my PhD was just how distinct Aotearoa New Zealand is in terms of the collectivization of risk. There's a different sense of individual risk in New Zealand. There's definitely a, you know, she'll be all right, you know, get her done yourself attitude, which I love. But at the same time, this is a country that has an ACC. In the thesis, I go through and thread this long line of responsibility of local councils that's a higher threshold of responsibility compared to England or Northern Ireland. And so that's sort of the context that we're working in New Zealand of this idea that you're owed, I'm not going to say it's a duty, you're owed a wee bit more by your local authority. And in the case, in the common law, it says just straight up, that is something about being in New Zealand that we will uphold, that the individual is owed just a wee bit more oversight in terms of local authority responsibility. Now, does this answer your question? Not really. What do I think about individual responsibility? Something that came up a lot in the interviews was how the technology improving is making it easier to put that responsibility onto the self. You know, if you know more about your health and you have more access to information about your health, does that make you more responsible for when things go wrong? Even if you're not a doctor, which I'm not, you know, next week. You know, and it's the same with, you know, the increasing technology to assess risk to property. You know, if we're foisting it onto individuals, do we then, what's the sort of the level of expectation we're foisting upon them then to remedy when that risk eventuates? I think we haven't figured that out yet because we tend to, you know, we have busy lives. We tend to just think, well, we've told them the thing, it's on the plan, good to go. And I think that might have worked for us for a very long time, but as we go into foreseeable risk in this way, it's gonna become a lot more of a tricky situation. And especially because the conversation always changes after the extreme weather event. Why didn't you tell me? And you're like, well, I did tell you. And as these extreme weather events happen more frequently, there'll be more conversations like that.
Well, I want you to join me in thanking Ben.
Cool, thanks everyone. I'll just reply to this question on Zoom from P tonight. Very good. Oh, very good. Is that good? Okay.
Thanks.